Hello, I'm Professor Susan Dodds, and I'm the Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Industry Engagement at La Trobe University. I'm delighted to be here tonight in Sydney for tonight's Ideas and Society event, Australia and China, a conversation with Paul Keating. I'd like to acknowledge that the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation are the traditional custodians of the land from which we're broadcasting La Trobe's Sydney campus, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome to the fourth event in this year's Ideas and Society program. The 13th year that Professor Emeritus Professor Robert Mann, the La Trobe University Vice Chancellor's Fellow, has presented Ideas and Society. Ideas and Society brings together eminent Australians to consider the big issues facing our nation and the world. This year's previous events have examined Russia's war on Ukraine, the crisis in Australia's aged care homes, and Australia's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. After tonight's discussion, the next event in the series is on the 25th of October, when Tim Flannery will talk with Ross Garnaut about his new book, The Superpower Transformation, Making Australia's Zero Carbon Future, which incidentally is published by La Trobe University Press. You can register via the La Trobe website. The final event of the year, in November, will be a discussion on the role of the Greens and Teal independents in the newly elected federal parliament, moderated by Cathy McGowan, another La Trobe University Vice Chancellor's Fellow, with Adam Bant and Max Chandler-Mather of the Greens, Zoe Daniel, a Teal independent, and Simon Holmes-A-Court, the founder of Climate 200 initiative that supported the election of several Teals to the House of Representatives. Now to tonight's event. The topic and our speakers barely need any introduction. There has been a huge interest in this event. In fact, we've had well over 3,500 registrations, which makes this one of the most popular discussions the university has ever held. Australia's location in Oceania between the Indian and Pacific Oceans means we should not and cannot ignore the forces at play in our region, especially those that are fundamental to our future. China's rise as a global economic and military power is just one such factor. We also find ourselves caught up in the deterioration of diplomatic relations between China and the United States. If anything, problems have only escalated during the pandemic, with trade embargoes and accusations of espionage on both sides, and new tensions related to Taiwan and Xinjiang. There is presently the threat of a new Cold War between these two powers, and it's becoming apparent that relations are unlikely to improve much under President Biden. What does this mean for our region, for our trade and our security? How does it affect human rights considerations or the global fight against climate change? After the AUKUS Treaty was created by the Morrison government, how much will Australia's approach to China change under Prime Minister Albanese? And what does our response to China mean for our relationship with the United States? Moreover, what is the policy dynamic between Washington, Beijing, and Canberra? We're delighted that former Australian Prime Minister, with deep experience and expertise in the geopolitics of Asia, is here to consider these and other questions with one of the nation's most astute historians and foreign affairs commentators. So it's my honor to introduce our distinguished guests. The Honourable Paul Keating served as Australia's 24th Prime Minister from 1991 to 96 and was Treasurer of Australia from 1983 to 91. His political legacy includes fundamental economic and social reforms, including deregulation of Australia's financial, product, and labour markets, establishment of Australia's compulsory superannuation system, native title legislation, and the formation of the Apex Leaders Meeting. Mr. Keating's books include Engagement, Australia Faces the Asia-Pacific, which was published in 2000 and translated into Chinese and Japanese, and a collection of post-prime ministerial speeches. Mr. Keating continues to contribute to public debate on Australian and international economic issues, geopolitics, foreign policy and security, and superannuation. He specializes on the geostrategic settings of East Asia. And Professor James Curran is Professor of Modern History at Sydney University and a Foreign Affairs columnist for the Australian Financial Review. He's written policy papers and analyses for the Lowy Institute and China Matters. James served as the Keith Cameron Chair at University College Dublin and was a Fulbright Scholar at Georgetown University. Prior to becoming an academic, he worked in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and as an intelligence analyst at the Office of National Assessments. James has published a number of books and journal articles on Australian political culture and foreign affairs. His book, Australia's China Odyssey, From Euphoria to Fear, was published by New South Books in August. I am very pleased to hand over to James to get the discussion underway. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Dodds, and I'd also like to extend our thanks and gratitude to Emeritus Professor Robert Mann, the convener of the Ideas and Society program at La Trobe University, and can I thank all of you who are in Australia and indeed around the world who have tuned in tonight to listen to this discussion with Paul Keating. Well, I think the debate over China and Australia's foreign policy in recent years has tended to be overly presentist. There are, of course, understandable reasons for this, but one of the problems with that is that sacrificed has been contextual and historical ballast. Mr. Keating and I have agreed in a pre-event discussion that this conversation should be about the tectonic forces of history that move beneath the surface of political events, and that we're about trying to discern the underlying patterns of international affairs rather than picking at disconnected shards. Now, a few years ago, the former US National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said that he was concerned that today's leaders no longer have the time to think historically. And he worried that the current crop of politicians are struggling, he said, to develop a perception of the world and of themselves. Kissinger went on to say, and I quote him, "We should deepen the current cognitive exercise to a level that is more compatible with conceptual thinking and less geared to the immediate emotion." So that's what we're about tonight in this discussion, which is about to follow. Paul Keating is a leader who, I don't think it needs any elaboration, who brought to office certain ideas about the world, ideas which were grounded in a view of history and the role of leaders in history, and which drew on a lifetime of thinking about the interplay between identity and culture. Paul Keating, thanks for making the time.
Thank you, James. Very glad to be here.
Well, with that introduction in mind and our purpose there, I want to take you back 80 years ago this year, the fall of Singapore in 1942. Now, you were born 2 years later, 1944, and the following year, your Uncle Bill died on the Sandakan-Ranau Death March. Now, you've said consistently throughout your career that the Second World War dragged us into Asia, and that as a result, there should have been no utterly dependent enmeshment with great and powerful friends as there had been before. You know, the strategic alignment with Britain to that point had clearly broken down. As you've pointed out on many occasions, we were, and I quote you, we were alone and palely loitering down here in this part of the world.
Yeah.
How many times do we want to be shown this lesson about the folly of dependence?
Well, I should have thought that having been shown it once and importantly, in 1942 to 1945, you wouldn't need to learn it again. That a society which has inherited a continent, I mean, I used to say to my cabinet that when they're giving out continents, not many people got one. So we have a border with no other state. We have a continent, and therefore our capacity to live a decent life here, to maintain the safety of our citizenry, to be able to reasonably defend the country if we need to, are all things that we are entirely capable of. And if you look at our recent experience in the 1980s and 90s, it's clear that we're able to do that. That's not to say that we told friends we don't need them anymore, like the United States, for instance, or we don't appreciate them. But the problem about enmeshment, geostrategic enmeshment, means that you compromise your foreign policy action. You outsource it to another state. That's what the enmeshment does. Whereas, for instance, the last thing I did as Prime Minister was enter into essentially a mutual defence pact with Indonesia. This is the Treaty on Maintaining Security that I entered into with President Suharto. 20 million of us, reasonably technically smart, 250 million of them, between the two of us, really able to withstand any regional pressure, if you like. In other words, left to ourselves, we can do these things. I mean, I put together, as we mentioned in the introduction, the APEC leaders meeting from a cold start with George Herbert Bush. Gareth Evans put together the Cambodia Peace Accords, the Chemical Weapons Convention. We're able to do these things. We're able to build our submarines. I mean, Kim Beazley and I were the moving force behind the Collins-class submarines. So the key is, if you own a continent, you keep other people's foot from it. In other words, you want sea denial capability. And we could do our own sea denial capability, run an intelligent foreign policy without being owned by the United States or anyone else. It's not intelligent to be owned. Yeah.
Well, no, that's right. I want to take you back then 30 years ago to 1992. You just mentioned some of the things that you initiated as Prime Minister, but in early 1992 you were a brand new Australian Prime Minister. You'd just taken over from Bob Hawke in December of 1991. You're coming to office at a period sort of towards the end of the 20th century when a great epiphany has almost taken place in terms of the geopolitical structure of that time. The end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union is wrapping up. The opportunity that is presented at that time to leaders such as yourself and, of course, presidents of the United States for wise and prudent statecraft, how did you see the opportunity at that point, and how did it relate to a particular view of history that you'd brought with you to office, that you'd been thinking about really since you were a young man, from some of the first books that you'd been reading about the leaders like Churchill and Roosevelt that had captured your imagination and propelled you into a political life?
Well, Mikhail Gorbachev let the Soviet Union down carefully, and President George Herbert Bush, along with people like James Baker, studiously and unboastfully let those pieces fall away from what was the union of the Soviet Union. And this happened, Gorbachev signed the document, I think 5 days after I became Prime Minister. So, and 5 days after that, I've got an American president at Kirribilli House in Sydney. So you could see there was a massive opportunity opening up for open regionalism. That is, with the bipolarity of the Cold War switched off, with the electricity turned off, and the states in the old Comecon group drifting away, states within the Soviet Union declaring independence, there was a chance for open regionalism. And if you look around this part of the world, where we could include, say, China, Vietnam, into the community of nations here. So it was with that in mind that I suggested to George Herbert Bush and General Brent Scowcroft, who was with him at the time, his national security advisor, that this was a chance to actually get the United States more engaged strategically in Asia and at presidential level, not Secretary of State or Treasury Secretary, which is what the first blush of APEC was about, but by bringing the authority of the presidency in there, which would mean to be someone in the White House every year, every week, worrying about East Asia, and the Pacific. And I thought then we could put together, see, until then, these meetings with the Chinese were held every decade or so, the Nixon Mao type meetings. And with the rise of China coming, and also with the Cold War finished, the status of a country like Indonesia as the leader of the non-aligned movement, and of Japan, which is always sort of loitering in Asia with China nearby. It was a chance, I thought, to bring that together. And Brent Scowcroft said to me at the meeting, which I think is recorded in a minute, he said, "Prime Minister, you're articulating a policy for the United States and Asia we have not articulated for ourselves." And that's the truth. I thought we had this post-Cold War opportunity, but I thought that extended beyond just the regional opportunities, which I saw.
Well, indeed, you said in that meeting, you said that the President, this is directly to President George H.W. Bush, you said the President now had scope to exercise international leadership in a way that was unprecedented since 1914. Russia, other former Soviet republics, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, China and Mexico were all trying to enter the world market. Against this background, it was crucial to put in place institutions as influential as the post-World War II Bretton Woods arrangements. So this is getting back to, is it not, that sort of Rooseveltian view of the world that gripped you and that fascinated you about, was this another chance for liberal internationalism to flourish in the world system?
Well, I've always been, my two, I don't have heroes much, but the two that come nearest are Roosevelt and Churchill. Churchill was a 19th century politician, Roosevelt was the 20th, but they had greatness about them, both of them. Liberal internationalism, which we hear so much of, but really only lasted 30 years. It lasted from about 1914-15 to 1945, with the death of Franklin Roosevelt. It was Woodrow Wilson and the First World War, and Franklin Roosevelt with the Second World War. Both believed in inclusion. Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, Franklin Roosevelt's United Nations. So they saw at the end of the conflagration of the First World War and the conflagration of the Second World War, the opportunity of having a more representative world structure. That is a multipolar world, not one just run by the victors of 1945, but a multipolar world. Of course, Roosevelt died before he could see the UN dream come true. The problem with the UN dream for him was that Stalin, as George Kennan remarked, Stalin had an ideological view. You see, the Soviet Union was an ideological state which was looking at some sort of world domination, right? It wasn't just a regional power. But take that Soviet thought out and look at Roosevelt's instincts. His instincts were for a multipolar world, which was truly representative, and of course the end of colonialism, right? So on the battleship, was it Missouri, with the Prince of Wales, one or the other, with Churchill.
Missouri, yeah.
Yeah, and Churchill wanted to hang on to, India, and Roosevelt said, no more the British in India, no more the Dutch in Indonesia, no more the French in Indochina. He wanted to see free people be free. He wanted to turn his back on colonialism, and he wanted representative power to be represented. That's what went missing at the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
That's the failure. It was a failure of Bill Clinton. It was a failure of George W. Bush. It was really the failure of Barack Obama and Trump.
So this is the failure of the United States to find and provide a place for China, India, Russia in a truly representative international structure, right?
Yeah.
So you would argue that instead what we got was post-Cold War confusion. Would that be right?
Oh, exactly. Well, the idea that you can have a unipolar world, that's the United States, the end of history. The end of history didn't last long.
Yeah.
That was the point.
Yeah.
Look, I've, I was saying, long time ago, from about 1997, I attacked the extension of NATO in 1997, trying to ring fence the old Russia, the old Soviet Union, biting off bits of the pie crust, and we can see where that's got us to. I was talking about a representative structure then, and I was urging Bill Clinton then to find a place for China then. And of course China strategically and economically was kind of nowhere much in 1996, 7, but it's always been my view, you'll never have an operative, peaceful world while ever we have, if you like, a G7 structure. I mean, look at the G7 for God's sake. We've got Italy and Canada sitting up there with Britain. And there's on the other side of the world there's China with a bigger GDP than the United States, but it's not in there.
I mean, it's very interesting in a sense that as the Berlin Wall fell, there was clearly a sense within the American administration at the time that this was not the opportunity to dance on the grave of Soviet communism. No. But by January 1992, when H.W. Bush gives his State of the Union address, he's saying, by the grace of God, America won the Cold War. Yeah. So you have this sense of American celebration, don't you?
Sure.
Right?
And they basically, at the very moment they could have, I said to Bill Clinton in one conversation, you guys are going to work out how you sit at the top table, at the top of the top table in 40 years from now. And of course to Americans I said, what do you mean? We're always at the top table, and that was trying to say, look, there will be other powers in the world, and the most obvious one, still Russia having nuclear weapons, and of course China.
That's right. In our preliminary discussion about tonight's event, you made the point. You said we've had 2 world wars to settle the status of Germany in Europe, and you recalled that at the point of German unification in 1871, the Kaiser was crowned at the Palace of Versailles with British, Russian and French diplomats presumably sort of cooling their heels on the gravel there at Versailles and saying, well, what are we going to do with this German upstart? Now we've got a new upstart with China. So what does this lesson tell us? Have we got to have another global war to settle the status of China? Well,
it's true. We had, as I said to you, James, we had 2 world wars to fundamentally settle the status of Germany. And in the end, of course, this is a point I've often made to people, you can have these conflagrations, but in the end there's a settlement after. Why not have the settlement before the conflagration? You would have thought even the Nazis, when they saw their country wiped out by the systematic bombing by the US and by Britain, that they would have said, right, well, we better do a trade now, So, this is the thing. But
this is the policy of what you call exasperated vengeance, the carpet bombing.
That's what it was with,
Dresden and
why
so
would you
forth.
wipe out Dresden, say, other than an exasperated vengeance, which is what it was. But look, I think that the big challenge is really the US and China. And, you know, I had views, there are people in the world whose views I share and enjoy. Henry Kissinger is one, Zbigniew Brzezinski was the other. Now, Brzezinski was the ultimate Cold War warrior. You know, he was a teenager when Hitler and Stalin split Poland. He was a Pole. He was a teenager when Hitler and Stalin split Poland. He became an American citizen. He became, you know, chief US strategic advisor to President Jimmy Carter. He was left to do basically the Nixon-Mao Accord after Nixon lost the presidency. Brzezinski was the guy that actually had to put it into place, you know. And he says, I've kept some things he said in 2012, which I think underline a lot of wisdom, sharing my views about it, right? He says that, he says, the United States, the central challenge over the next several decades will be to revitalise itself while promoting a larger West and accommodating China's rising global status. Accommodating, not competing, accommodating, right? He talks about a larger West, which includes Russia and Turkey. So a bigger West, and then he talks about in Asia, the US role should be that of regional balancer and conciliator, right? So the US is the guarantor in the Atlantic and the balancing power in the East. Not the guarantor, you know, not the hierarchical power, but the balancing power. He goes on to say, the US should respect, he says, the US can and should help Asian states avoid a struggle for regional domination by mediating conflicts and offsetting power imbalances among potential rivals. Sensible. And he says this, the US should respect China's special historic and geopolitical role in maintaining stability on the Far Eastern mainland. I'm going to repeat that, James, because I think it's so important. He says, the US should respect China's special historic and geopolitical role in maintaining stability in the Far Eastern mainland. He goes on, and he went on to say, the US must also recognise that stability in Asia can no longer be imposed by a non-Asian power, least of all by the direct application of US military power. Right, so in other words, what he is postulating here, see, he is saying what I've always believed, that is, the balancing power, the stabilising power in Asia is China. It's not Japan. Japan's already had a go at the rest of us. You know, the Second World War, the Russo-Japan War. It's unlikely to be doing this these days with a diminished population, but nevertheless, in this period, we're speaking of, China wasn't attacking anyone, and China's attacking nobody now. I mean, they live in that bowl. They've got, you know, Siberia and Mongolia to the north. They've got the Himalayas to the south and southeast. They've got Indochina to the south, and they've got the ocean to the east. Right? They live in the bowl. They don't attack other states. Right? So he says the US should respect China's special historic and geographic role. In other words, how do you respect their role? Given now that China's GDP on a purchasing power parity basis, which is the only really way to look at it, is 20% larger than the United States. So it's a country larger than the US in GDP terms, got a big navy, it's got 20% of humanity. So if you extrapolate Brzezinski's point, it would be that the US could run the world cooperatively with China. In other words, the US consolidates the Atlantic, a phrase I've used over and over in speeches. The US consolidates the Atlantic, which includes bringing Russia into Europe, and in the East, the stability is provided by the Chinese, but we're still with the US as a balancing power, right? That model would be, I think, advantageous for the whole world, because the Chinese are not trying to overturn the existing system, right? Firstly, let's get this clear. China is not the old Soviet Union. It's not exporting an ideology, right? It's part of the existing arrangements in the West. It's in the WTO, the WHO, the IMF, the World Bank. It wants to join the TPP. And this president was in Davos a couple of years ago arguing for globalisation, right? It doesn't want to upend the system. But it doesn't want to be, as big as it is, a stakeholder, to use a Bob Zellick expression, a stakeholder in a system, proprietary system run by the United States.
Yeah.
And frankly, with an economy this large and 20% of humanity, why should it? And why would it? You know, so the idea that you can get the G7 with Italy and Canada and Britain and sort of flag wavers like Australia on the side to say, we can sort of, in other words, regarding, I said this, I made a point, this is I spoke to the Foreign Affairs and Defence Secretaries and Establishment in Canberra in 2011. I said this, above all, for the US to not see China's rise as a strategic challenger and a full counter force. In other words, to see China's rise as simply the sensible development of the world, and I said we don't want a repeat of 1892 when Russia and France entered into an entente to balance off Germany, or when Britain joined it in 1904, right? So once you get bipolarity and rigidities, the death of the Crown Prince in Sarajevo blew the whole thing up. In other words, every movement is magnified in a rigid bilateral structure, bipolar structure.
Yeah.
So I've thought that you see, the Americans will say, a decade ago, there was discussion about the G2.
Right.
A G1 and
Condominium.
A G2. And the G1, of course, was the United States, and the G2 was China, right? In other words, you've got to get the subtlety. The G2 was a subordinate role, right? The Chinese are not going to be G2 anymore. What the Chinese want is a G1 and a G1, But a G1 and a G1, with a state which is living to itself, not attacking other people, is a major contributor to the world economy, has been a major force in keeping down inflation for 25 years, a major force in lifting 20% of humanity out of poverty. Is it beyond the wit of let's say the United States to come to a multipolar solution, which I might say includes states like India, which I've argued for, and Indonesia.
Yeah, sure.
In other words, but this idea that, the United States is the exceptional power, it's the proselytizer of democracy, it's got God's ear, and that the rest have got to, follow along. That was fine in the 20th century. The 20th century was the century of the United States. The 21st century is not the century of the United States.
Well, I wanted to actually just pick up on that, if I could. You made the key point about why can't we have a settlement before the conflict. The question is, you've already started to discuss it, are the Americans up to it? That is, when we're in a situation now where this bipolarity is already fairly deeply entrenched, when there is such a strong bipartisan consensus in Washington on either strategic competition or a new Cold War, where even the thought of America reaching a kind of an accommodation with China, or even a modus vivendi, is more or less quickly depicted as appeasement, or they'll throw the Munich myth all over it. Is this something that America can do? Can it give up this idea of its primacy?
Well, if it was led properly, yes, yes. But look, have a look at, James, China's ambitions are in the West, they're not in the East. There's a great confusion in countries like the US and Australia. It's all about the East and the South China Sea. That's the Chinese front door mat. They just don't want anyone with Taiwan or on their coast. What they're really interested in is the stand countries. They're interested in Central Asia, right? And as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative, I think you could say, without gilding the argument, that everywhere between Wuhan and Istanbul in the next 30 years will have a huge Chinese influence, right? They've already built a port for those countries, the stand countries, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, at Gwadar in the western side of Pakistan. Now, for the first time, these little states were lost in the old Soviet Union, you know. And so, and of course now, from under that plan, the Chinese plan, they have access to the Baltic through Gdansk. And you'll see the Germans and the French come on. So now the Chinese have always been about worrying about the Straits of Malacca and how they get goods and materials by land across the great steppes of Asia to China. And the Belt and Road will basically do that. So if you look at the capacity of China to grow, the other point worth making is this. The urban societies of the kind we live in are about 85 to 90% urbanised. That's the United States, Britain, Germany, France, Australia. China's 60%. It's got about 20% to go. It's got a lot of growth to go at home. As well as that, it's got the growth through Central Asia. So you wouldn't need to be a demographer or a statistician to work out in 25 or 30 years from now, if the Chinese economy is already 20% larger in GDP, according to the IMF, than the United States, where will it be then? And then what is the profit in the US not coming to terms with that geometry, with that mathematics, you know, that reality, you know? So the idea that we can, you know, sort of ring fence China on the basis it's kind of illegitimate because it's not attacking anybody. So what is the basis for it? It's kind of illegitimate. With sort of Japan, Australia, you know, the Quad, you know, India, is a piece of strategic nonsense, you know, and a good-minded, open-minded, creative American president could now still
pull it off,
develop a multipolar structure, you know.
Well, sometimes I wonder whether this is a question that Australian strategists and foreign policy thinkers have a certain difficulty in facing up to. That is, an America that may well stop believing in itself. I mean, this is a very different America that Australians would not be used to. I mean, we saw the reaction when Trump was elected, and Trump was not a believer in American exceptionalism. I mean, he didn't believe in the rules-based order. He didn't believe in alliances.
Well, there is no rules-based order. I mean, walking into Iraq, I mean, what rule was that?
Sure.
Afghanistan, what rule was that? You know, you know.
Can we just move on to the US alliance, actually, the US-Australia alliance, and talk about that in a little bit more detail, and I guess go back to some of that history as well, from when you were in government, but even before when you were in government. I just want to open it by mentioning a quote from a recent interview that I did with the CEO of the US Studies Centre, Michael Green, who mentioned you along with Hugh White and Bob Carr as being those who, he said, quote, openly questioned the alliance. And he said that you were apparently, he said, taking China's case to the Australian people in criticising the United States. And he added, he said, this was not a good look, and it did make people a bit nervous in the Obama administration and at the beginning of the Trump administration. Now, Paul Keating, can I ask what's your response to that kind of appraisal?
Well, the United States and people who represent the US these days are not interested in thinking allies. They basically have an open book for sycophants, not thinking allies. In my own case, I've made a few points here worth thinking about. The US is exceptionally ungrateful for people who have stuck to it through a lifetime. I'm one of them. Right? For 2 decades within the Labor Party, up to 1983-84, I supported the United States, the alliance, against what was then the pro-communist left, the soft pro-com left.
Yeah, so you were taking these
every
people
year.
on
John Howard would be at Church of England Sunday School bazaars while I was fighting the comms at the town hall. This is the real battle, right? When I went with Bob Hawke, he invited me to meet President Reagan on the first trip. We're on the old 707. And he said, because Bob had been supported by the left all his life, and he wanted to have these qualifications, with the US. And he's talking to me, I said, look, if I were you, Bob, I'd positively embrace President Reagan as a jolly sort of a guy, and your friend George Shultz. In our post-83 relationship, particularly with the problem with the Whitlam government in the 70s, fresh in their mind, the problem that Whitlam had with
Nixon.
And I said, Bob, this is the black and white brigade. They're not interested in greys. Let's embrace them enthusiastically and let's get on with it, right? That's more or less the fault. I'm not saying I was the sole person who was influential on Bob, but it was a big influence on him, right?
But that's when Bob Hawke said, we are together forever, Australia and the United States,
that's right.
Yeah.
And of course, Ronnie was a great host, let me say that. And then the first policy commitment, this is in my case, the first policy commitment after the Cold War was when the United Nations, supported by the United States under the presidency of George Herbert Bush, decided to resist Iraq and Saddam Hussein in his attack upon Kuwait, which we call Desert Shield, right? Now, I'm Deputy Prime Minister at this stage. I get called by Bob Hawke into a meeting, and Bob says, Bob, he never quite finished the sentence, Bob. He said, the President's going to call and wants to know what our position's going to be. And so I said, Bob, what about your mate Mulroney in Canada? You're telling me what a good fellow he is. And what about John Major in Britain? I said, they're members of NATO. What are they doing? Why would we be the first to put our hand up? And Bob said, it would be good if we kind of, So I sat through this meeting. I said, listen, Bob, I control the right of the party, more or less, in those days, right? I wasn't just Deputy Prime Minister. I said, Bob, look, if this is the first action by the United Nations in a post-Cold War world and the US wants to support that commitment, I'm for doing it. But I said, if your mates Mulroney and what's your name,
Major,
are dragging the chain, let's get in early. I'll put my hand up for this. Let's get in early, but at a low price. I said, for getting in early, we have a low price. So I said, we've got a tanker at the Gulf and we can put a destroyer up the top of the Gulf. And he said, Bob said, okay. I said, but Bob, no combat troops, no aircraft. You know, he said, oh no, that's okay. He pressed a button and the waiter came in and we all had a cup of tea and the sort of decision was taken. How much thanks have I got for the United States from that? Zero. Zero thanks. You know. Then when I saw what you mentioned, putting George Herbert Bush together, the APEC leaders meeting together, you know, the US was a Eurocentric show. It had no US policy, no Asia policy, no Pacific policy. It was always run by the Navy. Pacific policy was run out of Honolulu. There was no State Department. Oh, I come along, I'm the sort of Australian Prime Minister, so well, what about the Pacific? So I take on, with George Herbert's agreement, that I talk to, he says, if we do it, it'll blow up with us. Paul, you do it. So I took the Japanese Prime Minister, President Suharto, the leader of the non-aligned movement. I took the Prime Minister of Thailand, the Prime Minister of Singapore, the Prime Minister of Canada, etc. And over a period of time, I put together a consensus for the APEC leaders meeting. Right? George Herbert Bush loses the election and Bill Clinton gets the thing. I then offer to Bill Clinton the arrangements that I'd already formally put together. And he said to me, well, look, I won the election against George Bush saying it's the economy stupid and that I didn't want to be in foreign affairs escapades like Kuwait. And so what you're asking me to do is to go into essentially a strategic body. I said, that's what I am asking you. He said, I tell you what I'll be in it if you make it look like a trade body.
Right.
So he said, and he and I then argy-bargy that, and we decided to meet in Seattle, which is the home of Boeing and Microsoft, to look like jobs across the Pacific. But you and I know, when the American president sits down with the Prime Minister, with the President of China, the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of Indonesia, at leadership level, it is of course a strategic meeting. Right? This came out of Australian foreign policy. This was my gift, personal gift to the United States, for which Mike Green's will give you no thanks, no gratitude, right? So that's why I don't take any notice of them. You know.
Are you surprised by the sensitivity on the American side to this kind of criticism?
They want dummies as sort of interlocutors, you know. They don't, as allies. They thinking allies, let us do the thinking, they say. Well, we've let them do the thinking, and the thinking is not very good. You know, this is the point.
We'll come back to that question because there's a lot of sort of more recent developments on the question of the alliance and interchangeability of Australian and US forces that I think are worth picking up there. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you a question about the Quad and about the great hopes that have been invested in the Quad over recent years. It's of course been elevated to a leaders meeting now and has met more regularly in recent years. Now, one of the issues here, of course, is that since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've had a number of apologies delivered for India's position on that. Now, those apologies, to be fair, were given before India's President Modi gave Vladimir Putin a kind of a public clip over the ear recently, mind you, at the same time as Indian troops.
But not a strategic clip over the ear.
Public rebuke, yeah. But this, of course, is at the same time that India is still sending troops to exercises, military exercises with Chinese and Russian forces in Vostok, right? Yeah. Now, I guess one of the more prominent Quad advocates here from the ANU is Rory Medcalf. Yeah. He said at the outset of the Ukrainian crisis that India was taking, quote, a cold, interest-based approach to the plight of Ukraine, but in the long term, its future lay with the West. And he said that the success of the Quad and other friends of India in persuading India to change that approach is not going to come through some valiant appeal to values. He said it's going to come through helping India change its national interest calculations. So, What do you think of that idea that others can basically change the national interest calculation of India?
Well, this is just amateur hour nonsense. Look, the Quad is a piece of strategic nonsense. India isn't. India is important to Australia as the key state in South Asia and the dominator, if you like, of the Indian Ocean. We should be approaching India on that basis, not in some sort of, string of pearl idea that we can contain China, which basically is the idea of the late Prime Minister Abe, that we can string together US, Australia, to sort of resist China with India. I mean, could you imagine a flotilla of Indian naval vessels entering the Straits of Malacca and exiting into the South China Sea to fight the Chinese for Western values, US or Australian values? I mean, we'll never see this ever. Not a chance. I mean, I think, look, I should say this to you. Henry Kissinger and I served for years together on China, the board of China Development Bank, and we'd mostly have a dinner later, And in one of these dinners at the hotel, Henry said to me, Paul, he said that deep voice of his, you and I share a very important strategic idea that few share. And he said, but the big news, the big Brzezinski shares, the three of us share. And I said, what's that, Henry? He said, that India will never be part of the East Asian system. I've always believed that, you see. And I think that if China stays away from India in the Indian Ocean, you won't see any Indian naval activity or military activity in the South China Sea. In other words, the idea that the Americans and we, or the likes of Morrison, can string together some sort of defence structure around it is a piece of high nonsense. Now, let me just say about you mentioned Rory Metcalfe. I've got the quote from the Australian. I found this in the Australian. I assume it's the same quote, isn't it? Yeah. He says this: India, in its long term, its interests lay with the West. I mean, do you think there's one Indian politician who thinks its interests lay with the West? Its interests lay with Pakistan and the Middle East. And to some extent, notwithstanding the great wall of the Himalayas, with what the Chinese are up to. But no, he says its interests lay in the West. The success of the Quad and other friends of India in persuading India to change that approach is not going to, as you said, it comes to repeal the values. It's going to come through helping India to change its national interest calculations. In other words, here we are in Australia with a so-called academic telling how we can change India's, that's how pathetic it is, change India's national interest concern. Now, this fellow Metcalfe, he's got this he's got a little sort of bottle of Indo oil. It's like snake oil at a sort of rural fair. It works for every other sip of the Indo oil, and it does everything, right? This is it. I mean, and he gets column inches in the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age, and Financial Review. I mean, the problem about the immaturity of the Australian international debate is that people as ordinary as Metcalfe who fails to understand basic things should not be supported by editorial managers in any of the newspapers, but we're going to put up with these sort of fools regularly, Can
I come back to the question of the alliance, but with the United States, but more particularly on the question of sovereignty and Again, this is something that some former American officials and others have said that they're quite surprised by how sensitive Australia is about its sovereignty.
Yeah.
But how does that all stack up with the agreement that we signed with the United States and Britain, which is known as AUKUS?
Yeah.
How does it stack up with the increasing not only interoperability of United States and Australian forces, but as Defence Minister Richard Marles now calls it, the interchangeability of those forces? Yeah. Now, what does all this mean for our freedom of movement? I mean, have we had a sufficient debate in this country about those issues?
This is all done secretly by that genius Morrison, with the Americans. I mean, talking about legging him over, God, they must have just said, what a coup. And Americans have been boasting, we've now got Australia off the fence for 40 years, this sort of thing. Look, the cabinet I belong to built the Collins-class submarine. If I had have succeeded in winning the sixth pole, I won the fifth, I would have built another 6 Collins-class boats. So boat number 12 would have ended up being, the following one would have been boat number 1 of the next 12. You follow me? We would have had a permanent. The Collins-class boat was a completely successful boat. It could not be heard under the water. In exercises with the Americans, we were sinking American boats every time. I don't know whether people know that, but that's the truth of it, right? The Collins got a bad name because it had the wrong diesel engine, but that wasn't the design of the submarine. So Australia had the capacity to field its own submarine. And what was the submarines for? They were for sea denial. They were the defence of Australia. They were not designed to be picking off Chinese nuclear submarines on the continental shelf, the shallow continental shelf off the Chinese coast, which is what these Los Angeles class boats are designed to be. The US Los Angeles class boats are hunter-killers. And the Chinese, to give themselves, if you like, a nuclear response capability by submarines, if a submarine's carrying 12 or 15 or 16 missiles, it's a big boat. And if it's a big boat going across shallow waters off the continental shelf of China, it can be identified and destroyed, right? So we're shifting when the genius Morrison decided that we should be in this, and this is, I'm sure, egged on, I'm told this reliably, but I'm not certain of this, by Andrew Shearer, who's serving in the current Labor government. I hope they're not listening to him. He's the one who sunk the French boats for these, I understand, reliably told, we've moved away from the capacity to defend our island continent with a class of boats which were competent at it, that didn't need to have standby capabilities a long way away, as any submarine would have off the coast of China. And so when we signed up to the AUKUS, what we've done is sign up to a hunter-killer submarine which has got one purpose in the main, and that is to sink Chinese submarines. That's the main thing. So we're party to that now, when we shouldn't be party to it all.
I think you said at one point that their use would be basically like sheepdogs to keep the Chinese on the continental shelf
before they get in the Mariana Trench. Before they get in the Mariana Trench. So basically, I think we should walk away from the US nuclear submarine proposition. The British, of course, are just a joke. I mean, going to Cornwall to find our security in Asia, I mean, that's where James Cook and Arthur Phillip left 230 years earlier. I mean, do we really need to go back there? I mean, but we had Morrison, the super thinker, taking us there. What was the rest of it?
Well, I just also come back, the flip side of the...
Well, let me say the point.
Yeah.
I think we should walk away from the AUKUS agreement. We should build the submarines ourselves, a son of Collins or a daughter of Collins.
Yep.
Or, as Hugh White pointed out in a recent article he wrote, that the cost of the submarines, 8 of them, you could buy 25 submarines off the shelf, or 24 off the shelf, as though, say, the German or Dutch or Norwegian, Spanish submarines, In other words, what would you rather have? Given the fact that most of them, you can only have about a quarter of them at sea, what would you rather have? 24 submarines with 6 at sea, or 8 submarines with 2 at sea, and because they're nuclear submarines, they cannot be fielded without the support of the United States. If there's interoperability, it means our sovereignty is just simply swept. Our freedom of movement and sovereignty is simply swept away, and no self-respecting Australian should ever put up their hand for our sovereignty being subjugated in this way.
The Labor opposition at the time that Morrison made this deal was given, I think, less than 24 hours notice.
Yeah.
They were given very little time to consider the deal and its implications. Do you think their heart's really in it?
Well, the deal was supposed to provide 20 months of consideration. I think what the Labor Party in opposition should have said, well, thank you. Thank you for the briefing. We'll think about it. We've got 20 months to think about it. We'll think about it. Right? So they went for it. Now, that morning I heard about it early, and I put a statement out saying I was opposed to it, that I thought it would subjugate our sovereignty. So the Labor Party could have taken notice of me on this point, took no notice. I had no conversation with anybody, and of course they signed up. It doesn't mean to say they have to stay signed up, though.
No.
Developing... in my first speech in the House of Representatives in 1969, I talked about the fact that at the beginning of the Second World War, we were left with no military-industrial complex in Australia, and that we should develop it. I fundamentally supported the building of the Collins-class submarines and the Anzac frigates with Transfield in Melbourne, And as I said, I would have done a second lot of self, so I would have had 12 of these. I mean, it'll be a tragedy for Australia if we keep to the AUKUS agreement. You can have the AUKUS exchange of information, that's fine. We've been exchanging information with the POMs and with the Americans forever, but we ought to walk away from the Los Angeles class submarine.
Is the national security debate, though, I mean, do you think the current government would be concerned about being politically wedged on this by opposition leader Dutton? I mean, would this be a real concern for Labor, as being seen as weak on if they walk away from AUKUS, they'll be seen as weak on the alliance, untrustworthy. It'll be a repeat of those nightmares from the Cold War.
Yeah, but that's because governments in office should make their own stories. The stories that Bob Hawke, myself, Gareth Evans, the stories we made about our independence in Asia, our ability to do all these things. Kevin Rudd later with the East Asia Summit, Kevin's East Asia Summit, me with the APEC leaders meeting, Gareth with a great lot of regional foreign relations, like for instance with Ali Alatas in Indonesia, my relationship with Suharto, my relationship with the Prime Minister of Japan at the time, two Prime Ministers of Japan. I mean, we could do our thing. We could tell our story. We don't have to be caught in the Liberal Party's dumb story. And it is a dumb story.
Look, on the question of stories, actually, that provides a nice introduction to where I wanted to go now, and that is the question of national identity. Now, going back to the period of government where you were Prime Minister, there is a lot going on in that period about questions of identity, right? And Australia's national self-confidence and its regional outlook. And, you know, you said in a speech in early 1992 that in that decade Australia could be independent in ways that it had never been.
Sure.
And, of course, there'd been some changes under Whitlam and Fraser to various trappings. You know, the old relics of colonialism had kind of been sort of modified, and some of them had been tossed out. But it was your feeling that still we were lacking that sense of, I think, almost psychological release from that old imperial era, right?
Indeed.
And that, you know, all of these issues that you're putting forward at the time are integrated in a way that is unlike any previous prime ministership, whether it be native title, whether it be the question of moving towards an Australian republic, whether it be the APEC leaders meeting, and so forth. And you've mentioned the treaty that you signed with Indonesia. Now, just given the recent events that we've seen in terms of the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, I did just want to get your views on where the republic debate is headed. And of course, you would recall that when you were Prime Minister, you had a 73% approval rating just on that question of whether the Australian people wanted to move towards being a republic. And you offered the Liberal Party a stake in this, you know. You'd made it clear that you would maintain the Senate's role. The Senate would still be able to block supply. You know, the powers of the Governor-General would not be circumscribed. You weren't proposing that. Howard walked away from it, put a modality in the question that he knew would defeat it.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
You've got the history right. Look, the thing is that that I believe that if we were to, in the post-Cold War world, take our place appropriately in East Asia, you know, I've always taken the view we find our security in Asia, not from Asia. By holding hands with great powers, we find our security in Asia. Then you can hardly lift your head and say, by the way, our head of state is the Queen of Great Britain, is the monarch of Great Britain, you know. And I took this issue on at an election. This was in the policy speech of 1993. You know, I had people in the Labor Party with horrors thinking I would put this at an election. You know, people say, oh, well, of course, Keating had views about the Republic. Keating didn't have views about the Republic. He put a proposal at an election. And the proposal was that we would have a plebiscite around the question, do you think Australia should become a republic? Of which we had 73% support. Because the Prime Minister, me, I was out there arguing the importance of the Republic, which I always said would say more to us about ourselves than it would ever say to anybody else. But I thought in the post-Cold War world, particularly in the new relationship that I had personally invested with President Suharto in Indonesia, particularly, and all the other leaders that I was in touch with weekly in terms of developing that APEC leaders meeting and operating it, that turning up with the Queen of Great Britain, because I've got enormous respect for the Queen herself, but I'm talking about with the monarchy of Great Britain, was a joke for us, you know. At the same time, we didn't own up to the things we'd done to the Aborigines and the Torres Strait Islanders. You know, we sort of, you know, after there was, apart from the Northern Territory Land Rights Act under the Whitlam and Fraser governments, there was really nothing that the Aboriginal Affairs power was used in any substantial way. I saw the High Court decision in Mabo as a real opportunity to settle in some way the question of land rights, without which, and own up to what we'd done. So I made the reference speech and owning up. I said, we brought the alcohol, the diseases, you know, we did the murders, we took the children from their mothers. And at the same time, even though we've wiped out native title in Melbourne, Sydney and all the metropolitan areas, still large parts, the tracts of Australia were open to a claim under the Native Title Act, which I spent 8 months of 1993 putting into place, in the Parliament. So in other words, I wanted to turn over a new leaf for Australia. In other words, we had an Australian as our head of state, that we'd fessed up about what we'd done to the original inhabitants of the country. We tried to make reparations in terms of land with native title, and use this as a sort of a leitmotif of our goodwill towards the country, its original inhabitants, and the region, and the inhabitants of the region. This is what I thought was important. Now, how did John Howard's done the country a dreadful disservice in this, because, as you correctly say, I spoke to him on the telephone about all this, by the way, at the time. I wanted to make that change where the powers of the Governor-General would not be circumscribed or written down, where the Senate could still refuse supply. In other words, it was a model the Liberal Party could have just adopted. But Howard being, always driving in the rear view mirror, always driving backwards and at speed, wanted to keep the monarchy. So he put the question of not, do you want to be an Australian Republic, but rather, do you think Australia should be an Australian Republic, but rather, do you think we should have with a president appointed by the Parliament? And he knew that would fail, and then the Prime Minister didn't even argue that case. Howard as Prime Minister, and of course the thing failed. So where are we now? Well, Queen Elizabeth II has died. I met her and told her that I would not involve her family in any of this. I had a great relationship with her, really. I mean, I think the royal family would have been so glad for the referendum passed, to be honest,
This was at Balmoral in 1993.
Yeah, 1993, yeah. But now, could you say, oh, well, we were too... Look at the French. The French had a revolution for their republic. The Americans have a revolution for their republic. We couldn't even pinch ours off Queen Elizabeth II, who didn't want it. We couldn't take the title, even if the monarch was happy to give it. And in fact, I wouldn't be at all surprised if King Charles III, the King of Australia, doesn't volunteer to give us, to renounce his claim on Australia, right? So in other words, so the Republican movement say to me, oh, you should be up there now speaking for this. Why would you? I mean, we fluffed it, we fluffed it, So if Australians have so little pride in themselves, so little pride, that they're happy to be represented by the monarch of Great Britain, why would somebody like me want to shift their miserable view of themselves,
So Australians have failed to seize the Republic, they've failed to claim it as an example of their sovereignty.
Well, not all Australians, because the thing was close run and properly argued by the then Prime Minister would have succeeded. So the best instincts of Australia were visible in that campaign and in those results. But of course, you've got people now, who in their right mind could believe that the monarch of Great Britain could represent our aspirations here, whether we are multicultural or not? And we are multicultural, but just in the region, we occupy one of the oldest land masses, the oldest continent on Earth, with the first, one of perhaps the oldest society on Earth. But we think, how, it's so pathetic that it barely doesn't need an argument, that we have the monarch of Great Britain, and there's, Morrison running off to Cornwall with that other fruitcake, what's his name? Boris Johnson.
Charles III as King of Australia doesn't exactly grab you.
Charles III, King of Australia, is a constitutional aberration. That's what it is.
Can I just ask a final question to perhaps tie this all together? In an interview when you first became Prime Minister, you said, and I quote, "In the Prime Ministership is vested the ideal of the nation and its aspirations." What's the ideal now for this place, Australia, to strive towards, in your view, and where are the aspirations for this country?
I think Australia has a very poor idea of itself now. Its head of state is a monarch of another country. Its strategic sovereignty has been outsourced to another state, a North Atlantic state, the United States. It doesn't know what it is or what it should be. You know, it doesn't know what it is and what it should be. Yet the inheritance, the gift of the continent is such a great gift, you know. I mean, look at these issues we have with China. China's 13 flying hours from Sydney. 13 flying hours. You know, here we are, we're manufacturing a problem for ourselves, you know. And, you know, and I'll just say that, you know, the problem we have in tying ourselves to the United States in Asia so uncritically is the United States has no idea what to do with itself in Asia. None. It has no coherent plan about what it wants to do and what can it do. Have a look at what's happened as indications of this. We had President Obama talking about the pivot. Nothing happened. He made the big speech in Tokyo about the Senkaku Islands, about how they would regard that as Senkaku as part of Japan and came under the articles in the agreement. What do we think about that? You know, China now has a big navy. You know, if we want to be hanging around behind the Americans, what is their policy? What is their strategy in Asia? You know?
Well, we've seen President Biden now virtually unpick strategic ambiguity on no less than 4 occasions. It seems to be walked back every time. Can you see any instance in which an Australian government of either political persuasion would say no to America if there was in fact a conflict over Taiwan?
If I was Prime Minister, I'd certainly say no. And I've said, Taiwan, I repeat, is not a vital Australian interest. We should be no more interested in the political system of Taiwan than the political system of Vietnam or Kazakhstan. Why should we be interested in the political? I mean, look, remember this. Taiwan's democracy started in 1996, not 1906, 1996, when Lee Teng-hui decided, oh, look, what we should have is a bunch of municipal... We can't have the Kuomintang, the KMT, as a sole party forever. Let's have some multi-party so we have a bunch of municipal elections to see who runs the place. And for that municipal election, we have World War III. Is that the proposition? For Taiwan's municipal election, we have World War III. You know, I mean, the Americans, if I've got any advice for them, is to stick to strategic ambiguity like glue, because taking on, and of course the other thing about, you see, Normandy was possible because 21 miles from Normandy was an industrial state, Britain. There was no radar, there were no satellites, you know, and under the cover of bad weather, we were able to make the landings at Omaha Beach and at Normandy. There's no Western state within 21 miles Taiwan. In fact, China's 90 miles from Taiwan. So China would see every amphibious vessel coming from the United States, whether it's Guam or whether it's San Diego or whether it's Honolulu, they'd see them and they would sink them. So the chances of the Americans having a victory over Taiwan is nil, in my opinion. And why would we want to be part of that defeat? Why would we? And of course, if in the end, finally, the Americans walk away from East Asia, we're left behind. I said to somebody recently, we can't put an outboard motor on Australia at Broome, start the motor and sort of move the continent off to San Diego. We're stuck here as the Americans take off back to their continent across the other side of the Pacific. We live in a Chinese world. That's the truth of it.
Is this part of the problem that we've mortgaged ourselves so closely to US policy that if there was, for example, a sudden change in US policy, and we've seen this happen before, however unlikely it may seem in the current circumstances and with the kind of consensus in Washington, that Australia could be left like a shag on a rock?
Yeah. If the Americans decide, if, for instance, it came to a fight over Taiwan, a fight they lost, their guarantees to Japan and Korea would fall down, and then possibly the US would just simply walk away. The thing is, we can't walk away. We're stuck here, And that's why it's just so unintelligent to be running this sort of a policy. When we showed in the 80s and 90s we could run a very intelligent policy with China, but with the region, with Indonesia. I mean, our bread is buttered in the Indonesian archipelago. It's Southeast Asia that matters to us. This is a point I made on a television interview. I said, if you look at I gave the seesaw analogy, the park seesaw. If you regard west and east of movements in the seesaw as problems, let's say in the east with Japan and China, in the west with India and Pakistan, but at the central focal point, the fulcrum point, that's Indonesia and Southeast Asia, we don't have these risks, right? So, I mean, we should be concentrating ideally I'd see us as a member of ASEAN, and in the agreement I had with President Suharto, with Anza's words, in what is effectively the agreement of maintaining security, which John Howard lost because of his celebration of General Cosgrove.
Yeah.
When he brought Cosgrove back with these ticker-tape celebrations in Melbourne and Sydney, President Habibie of Indonesia said, you were representing a UN mission and you look as though you're conducting yourself as though you are some sort of victorious invading force, so I'm suspending the agreement that Keating made with Suharto. Well, the agreement was essentially, if there was an attack on Indonesia, we would regard that as an attack on us. An attack on us would be regarded in Indonesia as more or less an attack on them. And that would mean we had more or less a mutual defence pact. This required conversation, of course, but a mutual defence pact. And as a Labor Prime Minister, I put together an Anza's worded defence pact with the largest Muslim state in the world, the leader of the non-aligned movement. Could you imagine anyone in the Liberal Party doing such a thing? Could you imagine any one of them?
Well, I think you said it was like a steel ring fence across the top of the country.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so our bread is still buttered in that archipelago. And imagine if we'd have spent the last 20-odd years working in cooperation under that agreement with Indonesia instead of wasting our time on this nonsense like the Quad and, American hopefulness about China, isn't it a pity they're not going to be a sort of Jeffersonian liberals,
So the new government, just to tie this up, the new government has started to sort of change its tone. It's talked about stabilising the relationship with China. it's kind of it's poured out the vocabulary of the Morrison government, on whether it be drums of war or so forth. It's talking about a First Nations foreign policy. It's enunciating its commitment to ASEAN centrality. Does this give you a bit more optimism about where?
Only this. Tone has got to become substance. You know, tone is one thing, substance is another, you know, and I wish the government well in this, and time will tell. At least it's not the appalling policy which was conducted by Scott Morrison.
All right, well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Paul Keating, for your time. I think we covered a lot of territory there. History, as we know, if it repeats, doesn't repeat exactly the same, but certainly a greater knowledge of history can help us clarify the argument and enlighten the judgment, let's hope. So thank you very much for that tonight.
Thank you, James, for conducting an insightful discussion.
Thanks very much. Thank you.